Chapter 1. You already feel it. Don't argue with me yet. Just sit with that sensation for a second. The quiet irritation you can't explain. The way conversations feel thinner than they used to. The way her reactions don't quite line up with what you're saying anymore. You've been telling yourself you're tripping, that you're overthinking, that you're being insecure. That's the lie men tell themselves, right before reality forces the lesson harder than it ever needed to be. I'm not here to scare you. I'm here to say the thing you don't want said. Cheating doesn't begin with sex. It doesn't begin with opportunity. It begins with detachment, and detachment doesn't announce itself with drama. It shows up as small emotional withdrawals that are easy to dismiss if you want to stay comfortable. Most men do. That's why they're blindsided later and shocked by something that was telegraphed weeks or months in advance. Look at how she listens now. Not whether she hears you, but whether she absorbs you. When a woman is emotionally present, she reacts to your energy, not just your words. She responds to your tone, your mood, your presence. When detachment starts, responses become procedural. Short acknowledgments, surface-level engagement. She's there, but she's not with you. That difference matters more than any text message or social media behavior you'll obsess over later. Men love to focus on obvious signs, because obvious signs give them permission to react. They wait for proof. They wait for evidence. They wait for something undeniable so they can justify feeling the way they already feel. But the body knows before the mind does. That tension you feel when she pulls away from eye contact, when affection feels delayed instead of natural, when laughter feels forced instead of spontaneous. That's not paranoia. That's perception trying to break through denial. One of the first shifts happens in how she protects her emotional space, not privacy. Emotional space. She starts keeping parts of herself compartmentalized. You'll notice it in how stories get shorter, how explanations get vaguer, how you're no longer invited into her inner dialogue the way you used to be. When asked what's wrong, she says nothing. When asked what she's thinking, she says she's tired. Those answers aren't lies, they're shields. This is where men make their biggest mistake. They interpret emotional withdrawal as a communication problem instead of what it actually is, a redirection of investment. They think they need to talk more, explain better, reassure harder. So they lean in. And leaning in at this stage doesn't fix anything. It accelerates the imbalance. Because while you're trying to reconnect, she's already rehearsing emotional independence from you. Pay attention to how respect starts eroding before loyalty does. She becomes more dismissive, more comfortable challenging you in ways she didn't before, more likely to speak sharply without repairing it afterward. Respect erodes because emotional allegiance is already shifting. You don't disrespect someone you're emotionally bonded to. You don't talk recklessly to someone whose approval still matters to you. Tone is one of the earliest indicators, and men ignore it because it doesn't feel serious enough to confront. Another subtle shift is how your absence starts feeling convenient instead of uncomfortable to her. When a woman is bonded to you, distance feels like a loss. When detachment begins, distance feels like relief. She doesn't miss you the same way. She doesn't check in the same way. She fills time easily. That doesn't mean she's cheating yet. It means she's practicing a life where your presence isn't necessary for emotional regulation anymore. Men want betrayal to be dramatic because drama gives closure, but what actually happens is quieter. She starts treating you like a role instead of a person. The boyfriend role, the partner role. You get the minimum required interactions to keep the structure intact, but the warmth is gone. And when warmth disappears, it doesn't vanish into thin air. It goes somewhere. Energy doesn't evaporate. It redirects. Here's where this gets uncomfortable. The moment you feel like you're competing with something you can't see, you probably are. Not a person yet. A possibility. A version of herself she's exploring mentally where she's not accountable to you. Cheating starts in the imagination long before it starts in real life. Once she imagines herself without you, loyalty becomes conditional instead of default. There's one story that captures this pattern cleanly, and if you've lived it, you'll recognize it instantly. A man notices his woman becoming colder, not hostile, just colder. Conversations feel transactional. Sex feels less connected. When he asks what's wrong, she says she's stressed. He responds by being more attentive, more accommodating, more patient. Meanwhile, she starts confiding emotionally in someone else. Nothing physical at first, just understanding, just listening, just validation. By the time the man finds out, she tells him it just happened. It didn't. It was prepared quietly over time. Most men don't lose their woman to another man. They lose her to a version of herself that no longer sees him as central. The other man is just a vehicle. The decision was made long before he entered the picture. That's why focusing on the other guy is a waste of time. The real shift happened internally, and that's what you're meant to recognize early if you're paying attention. When emotional detachment sets in, accountability starts disappearing too. She becomes less concerned with how her actions affect you. She justifies behavior she would have apologized for before. She frames your reactions as the problem. She tells herself a story where you're unreasonable, insecure, or holding her back. That story is necessary to bypass guilt. Nobody cheats while seeing themselves as the villain. They rewrite the narrative first. Men often sense this narrative shift but don't know how to name it. You feel misunderstood suddenly, like she's interpreting everything you do in the worst possible light. That's not coincidence. That's psychological distancing. The more negatively she frames you, the easier it becomes to justify disloyalty later. Again, this isn't conscious in most cases. It's protective self-deception. If you're listening to this and feeling defensive, pause. Defense is usually the last stage of denial before acceptance. I'm not saying she's cheating. I'm saying these behaviors are the runway. And ignoring the runway doesn't stop the plane from taking off. It just ensures you'll be surprised when it does. Here's the part men don't want to hear. You can't talk a woman out of detachment once it's underway. You can't argue her back into emotional loyalty. You can't convince her to feel differently. Feelings don't respond to logic. They respond to environment and consequence. And most men try to fix feelings with words long after words have lost their influence. This chapter isn't about paranoia. It's about awareness. If you're noticing these shifts, the worst thing you can do is pretend they're nothing. The second worst thing is to panic and overcorrect. Awareness doesn't mean accusation. It means observation. It means watching behavior without filling in the blanks prematurely. Cheating isn't a single act. It's a process, and processes can be interrupted when recognized early. If this already feels uncomfortably familiar, don't rush to conclusions yet. Sit with it. Let it marinate. If this chapter is putting language to something you felt but couldn't explain, like the video, not because it feels good, but because clarity always comes before relief. In the next chapter, we'll talk about the behavioral shifts that happen next, how communication changes, how attention reallocates, and why men usually notice too late because they're looking in the wrong places. Chapter 2. Communication doesn't disappear when she's on that path. It mutates. And that mutation is where most men get lost because they're still listening for honesty when the language has already shifted into management. You'll notice she starts communicating in ways that reduce friction, not in ways that increase connection. She keeps things smooth, polite, efficient. She answers questions without expanding on them. She updates you on logistics, but not emotions. It feels like you're getting information without intimacy, and that difference matters more than the information itself. When a woman is emotionally aligned with you, communication is messy in a healthy way. She shares thoughts before they're fully formed. She reacts in real time. She brings you into her internal world even when it's inconvenient. When detachment begins, communication becomes curated. She decides what's worth sharing and what isn't, not to protect you, but to protect her growing independence. That curation is subtle enough that men often miss it because nothing overtly wrong is being said. You might also notice how timing changes. Responses come later than they used to. Not dramatically late, just late enough to feel different. Calls get returned, but not with urgency. Conversations that once flowed now feel scheduled. And if you bring it up, you're told she's busy, tired, overwhelmed. Those things may be true. But truth doesn't cancel pattern. Patterns tell you what someone prioritizes when life gets full. And priority is the currency of loyalty. Another shift happens in how conflict is handled. She becomes either unusually calm or unusually defensive. Calm in a detached way, like she's already made peace with outcomes you're still fighting for. Or defensive in a way that feels disproportionate to the situation. Both responses serve the same function. They prevent deeper examination. They keep the surface intact while the foundation quietly erodes. Men often interpret that calm as maturity. They tell themselves she's grown, that she's more composed. But emotional composure without intimacy isn't growth, it's withdrawal. When someone stops caring whether a disagreement gets resolved emotionally, it means they're already emotionally elsewhere. Resolution matters most when you're invested. When you're not, you just want the noise to stop. Pay attention to how she reacts to your vulnerability during this phase. When detachment hasn't begun, vulnerability pulls her closer. She softens, she reassures, she engages. When detachment is underway, vulnerability becomes inconvenient. She listens, but there's no depth, no follow-up, no emotional resonance. She may even subtly minimize it, not cruelly, casually. That casual dismissal is more telling than any argument ever could be. This is also when attention reallocates quietly, not in obvious ways like disappearing all night, but in micro choices. She's more present on her phone than with you, more animated talking about other people than about shared plans, more invested in external validation than internal connection. Men fixate on phones because they're tangible. But the phone isn't the problem. It's the redirection of emotional energy away from the relationship. A common mistake men make here is confronting too early and too emotionally. They sense distance and demand reassurance. They ask if everything's okay. They ask if she still loves them. Those questions feel reasonable, but they put her in a position where honesty would create immediate conflict. So she reassures. And reassurance at this stage doesn't mean alignment. It means delay. It buys time. Time to continue detaching without triggering confrontation. You can feel the difference between reassurance that calms you and reassurance that confuses you. When reassurance is genuine, it settles your nervous system. When it's strategic, it leaves you unsettled. You walk away from the conversation with more questions than answers. That lingering discomfort is your intuition picking up on incongruence. Words and energy aren't matching anymore. Another behavior that shows up is selective honesty. She tells the truth about small things while omitting larger emotional shifts. That partial honesty creates plausible deniability. If you ever confront her later, she can point to all the times she didn't lie. And she'd be right. She didn't lie. She just didn't include you anymore. That distinction matters, and it's why men feel gaslit even when no direct lies were told. Watch how she starts framing you to others. You might notice subtle criticisms creeping into casual conversation. Jokes that paint you as out of touch, controlling, boring, or emotionally unavailable. Those narratives aren't random. They're preemptive. They lay the groundwork for justification later. When someone plans to violate their own values, they first adjust the story so they don't feel like the villain. Men often hear about these comments secondhand or pick up on them intuitively. Something feels off in how she describes the relationship publicly versus privately. That split is important. When someone starts separating the internal reality of the relationship from the external presentation, it's a sign of psychological distancing. She's no longer fully identified with us. She's rehearsing an I narrative instead. This is where patience becomes critical, not passive patience. Observational patience. You don't accuse, you don't spiral, you watch. You note changes without trying to control them. Control triggers defensiveness. Observation reveals truth. If detachment is temporary, behavior will realign naturally. If it's directional, patterns will continue. You don't need to force clarity. It arrives on its own when you stop interfering with it. Men get impatient here because uncertainty is uncomfortable. They want resolution. They want certainty. They want to know if they're being cheated on. But the question isn't whether she is cheated yet. The question is whether she's still emotionally choosing you. Cheating is a symptom. Emotional exit is the disease. Focusing on the symptom keeps you reactive. Addressing the disease requires steadiness. One of the hardest things for men to accept is that loyalty isn't enforced through surveillance. You can't monitor someone into fidelity. You can't check enough phones, ask enough questions, or create enough rules to prevent detachment. The moment you feel the need to monitor, the dynamic has already shifted. At that point, your job isn't to police. It's to evaluate whether the relationship still meets your standards for trust and alignment. There's a calm power in not reacting immediately, in letting someone reveal where they're going by how they move when you stop chasing certainty. That calm isn't apathy. It's confidence in your ability to handle outcomes. When you're not afraid of the truth, you don't rush it. And when you don't rush it, people show you exactly who they're becoming. If you're listening to this chapter and recognizing these communication shifts, don't jump to conclusions yet. Awareness doesn't require action right away. It requires clarity. If this chapter is helping you understand why things feel different, even when nothing obvious has happened, like the video, not as agreement, but as acknowledgement that you're learning to read patterns instead of chasing proof. In the next chapter, we'll talk about the internal narrative shift that happens right before cheating becomes physical, and why by the time men get confirmation, the emotional decision was already made. Chapter 3. By the time things turn physical, most of the work has already been done inside her head. That's the part men rarely see because it doesn't look like betrayal yet. It looks like reframing. She starts narrating her own story differently. Not out loud at first, quietly, internally. And once that narration changes, behavior follows with almost mechanical precision. The first internal shift is how she reinterprets the past. Moments that were once neutral or even positive get reclassified as negative. She remembers disagreements as patterns. She remembers your flaws as neglect. She remembers compromises as sacrifices she never agreed to. This isn't lying. It's memory being edited to support a future decision. People do this instinctively when they need to feel justified about where they're headed. You'll notice this when she brings up old things that were already resolved. Not angrily, casually, as if they're still relevant, as if they explain how she feels now. That's not about closure. That's about constructing a narrative where emotional withdrawal feels reasonable instead of abrupt. When the past starts getting rewritten, it's a sign the present has already shifted. At the same time, the future gets fuzzier. Plans feel less concrete. Conversations about what's coming next lose enthusiasm. She's still participating, but there's a lack of imagination. She doesn't lean into shared vision the way she used to. That's because she's imagining a version of the future where you're not central anymore. And imagination is powerful. Once someone can see themselves elsewhere, staying put starts feeling like delay instead of commitment. This is where moral licensing creeps in. She tells herself she's been patient, that she's tried, that she deserves happiness. Those statements aren't wrong on their own, but when they're used to override loyalty instead of repair connection, they become permission slips. Nobody cheats while believing they're being unfair. They cheat while believing they're reclaiming something they were denied. Men often sense this moral shift before they can articulate it. You feel like you're suddenly on trial, like your actions are being judged against an unspoken standard you didn't agree to. You can't seem to do anything right, not because you're failing, but because the verdict has already been decided. That's a painful realization, and most men resist it because it means accepting loss before it's visible. Another internal change is how she manages guilt. Guilt doesn't disappear. It gets outsourced. She externalizes responsibility for her feelings. If she feels distant, it's because you didn't do enough. If she feels tempted, it's because the relationship lacked something. This externalization isn't malicious. It's self-protective. It allows her to move forward without seeing herself as the cause of harm. You can hear this in how she frames conversations. She starts using language that distances herself from choice. Things are just happening. Feelings are confusing. Situations are complicated. That vagueness isn't confusion, it's insulation. The less specific she is, the less accountable she feels. And accountability is the last thing someone wants when they're preparing to cross a line they still believe in morally. Men often respond to this stage by trying to reassert connection. They plan dates. They initiate deeper talks. They attempt to remind her of what they have. Those efforts aren't wrong. They're just late. Connection can't be reinstalled once the internal exit is underway, unless she wants it too. And wanting it requires confronting the discomfort she's been avoiding. Most people choose the path of least resistance instead. This is also when idealization of the alternative begins. Not necessarily another person yet, but another life. A life with fewer constraints, fewer explanations, fewer compromises. That imagined life becomes emotionally attractive because it's untested. It hasn't disappointed her yet. Reality always loses to fantasy in the short term. That's why fantasy is dangerous when it's used as an escape instead of inspiration. If there is another person involved, they're usually not special in any objective sense. They're attentive, available, affirming. They don't carry the weight of shared history or unresolved conflict. That contrast makes them feel significant, even if they wouldn't be under different circumstances. Men fixate on this other person because it feels personal. But the truth is, the role mattered more than the individual. Anyone who fit the role would have done. This is where men often ask what they could have done differently. It's a natural question, but it's the wrong one at this stage. The better question is when the internal shift began and whether it was visible. In most cases, it was. It just wasn't recognized because it didn't come with sirens. It came with silence, with softened boundaries, with emotional distance disguised as peace. One of the hardest truths is that once someone starts justifying disloyalty internally, words stop mattering. You can be kind. You can be rational. You can be understanding. None of it reaches the place where the decision is being made. That place is protected by narrative. And narratives aren't dismantled by logic. They're dismantled by reality. Either the relationship becomes undeniably aligned again, or the narrative completes its arc. Men who sense this early sometimes try to regain control by tightening restrictions, checking phones, asking questions, setting rules. That approach backfires because it confirms the narrative she's already building, that you're controlling, that you're insecure, that you're the problem. Surveillance doesn't restore loyalty. It accelerates resentment. The more you try to contain someone who's emotionally leaving, the faster they justify leaving entirely. What actually matters at this stage is how you respond internally, not outwardly, internally. Do you abandon your own standards to hold on to access? Do you ignore your intuition to preserve comfort? Do you start negotiating dignity for reassurance? Those choices don't stop cheating. They just erode your self-respect before the outcome is clear. There's a steadier response that men rarely consider, one that doesn't involve accusation or control. It involves observing behavior without chasing explanation. It involves reclaiming your own center, focusing on your life, your direction, your energy, not as a tactic, but as alignment. If she realigns, you'll feel it. If she doesn't, the truth will surface without you forcing it. Either way, you preserve your footing. This chapter isn't about blaming women. It's about understanding how emotional exits work. They're quiet. They're rationalized. They're staged internally long before they're acted on externally. Once you understand that, you stop waiting for proof and start paying attention to process. Cheating isn't an explosion, it's an erosion. And erosion leaves signs if you're willing to look at the ground instead of the horizon. If this chapter is helping you see how betrayal is prepared long before it's executed, take a second and like the video, because understanding patterns is how you protect your future, not your ego. In the next chapter, we'll talk about what actually disrupts this process when it's caught early, what doesn't work at all, and how men can respond without losing themselves to suspicion or control. Chapter 4. What actually disrupts this process isn't confrontation, and it isn't surveillance. Those feel active, so men reach for them instinctively, but they don't touch the core of what's happening. They operate on the surface, where the story is already being managed. What interrupts emotional exit is a change in environment, not an increase in monitoring. And environment includes you, your presence, your availability, your orientation toward your own life. When men sense something slipping, the reflex is to clamp down. Ask more questions, seek reassurance, stay closer. But closeness without desire feels invasive, not comforting. It confirms the internal narrative she's already building that she's being crowded, restricted, or misunderstood. That doesn't pull her back. It gives her justification to pull away faster. The irony is that the very behaviors men use to try to save the relationship often supply the emotional permission needed to leave it. What actually changes the trajectory, when anything can, is a reassertion of self that doesn't ask for approval. Not theatrically, not performatively, quietly. You stop orbiting the uncertainty. You stop centering conversations around the relationship's fragility. You redirect energy back into your own structure, your work, your health, your direction. That redirection isn't punishment, it's alignment. And alignment has gravity. This is hard for men because it feels like giving up control. In reality, it's the only way to regain agency. Control is trying to force an outcome. Agency is being prepared for any outcome without losing yourself. When you move from control to agency, your energy shifts. You're no longer anxiously scanning for signs. You're no longer emotionally chasing reassurance. You're observing from a grounded place. That shift alone can interrupt the detachment process because it changes the dynamic she's responding to. There's a moment, when done correctly, where she notices the difference. Not consciously at first. She feels it. You're less reactive, less available, less predictable. Not cold, not cruel, just centered. And that centering creates friction in the narrative she's been building. Because now the story that you're needy, insecure, or dependent doesn't match reality. When narratives crack, people either re-engage to repair the bond or accelerate their exit to preserve the story. Either way, clarity increases. Men often ask what to say during this phase. The answer is usually less than you think. Over-explaining feeds the old dynamic. You don't need to announce boundaries dramatically. You simply enforce them through behavior. If communication becomes disrespectful, you disengage. If effort drops, you stop compensating for it. If plans become vague, you stop anchoring your schedule around them. Those adjustments aren't manipulative. They're responsive. They reflect what's actually happening instead of what you hope is happening. This is where men confuse detachment with strength. Detachment is emotional withdrawal used to protect ego. Strength is emotional presence combined with boundaries. You're still open, still attentive, but you're not chasing alignment that isn't being reciprocated. That balance is difficult because it requires tolerating uncertainty without dissolving into anxiety. But anxiety is what erodes respect fastest. Calm uncertainty preserves it. There's one story that illustrates this difference cleanly. A man notices his partner becoming distant. Instead of confronting immediately, he stops centering his life around her availability. He doesn't accuse, he doesn't interrogate, he invests in his routine, he maintains warmth without overinvestment. Over time, she either leans back in, sensing the shift and re-engaging emotionally, or she drifts further, making her intentions clear without him forcing them out. In both outcomes, the man keeps his dignity intact. He doesn't beg. He doesn't explode. He doesn't lose himself trying to manage someone else's internal process. Most men never try this because it feels passive. It's not. It's disciplined. Discipline looks passive to people who are used to emotional urgency. But urgency rarely produces truth. It produces temporary compliance at best. Discipline produces clarity. And clarity is what you need when loyalty is in question, not reassurance. Another mistake men make at this stage is trying to be better in ways that aren't authentic. Suddenly changing behavior drastically, becoming overly accommodating, over-gifting, over-promising. Those moves feel like effort, but they register as panic. Panic doesn't inspire respect. It signals fear of loss. And fear of loss shifts power further away from you, not back toward you. If reconnection happens, it happens because the emotional bond reactivates naturally. Not because you convinced her, but because the environment changed. She feels the difference in how you move. She senses that access to you isn't unconditional, that awareness can reignite attraction if it hasn't already been extinguished. But it's important to understand this clearly. You're not trying to save the relationship at all costs. You're evaluating whether it's salvageable without sacrificing self-respect. That evaluation requires honesty most men avoid. You have to ask yourself whether you want someone who needs to be reminded not to leave, whether you want to rebuild trust after emotional detachment has already progressed, whether you're staying because you believe in the connection or because you're afraid of being alone. Those questions aren't answered through conversation. They're answered internally, through how you feel when you imagine staying versus walking away. A lot of men stay too long because they confuse patience with loyalty. Loyalty isn't tolerating erosion indefinitely. Loyalty is honoring agreements that still exist. When emotional agreements are being quietly abandoned, patience turns into self-betrayal. And self-betrayal doesn't prevent cheating. It just ensures you're diminished by the time the truth arrives. There's also the temptation to become suspicious of every woman after experiencing this pattern. To assume detachment always leads to betrayal. That's another overcorrection. The goal isn't to become hyper-vigilant, it's to become perceptive. Perception doesn't panic, it notices trends. It distinguishes temporary stress from directional withdrawal. It responds proportionally instead of catastrophically. If you're listening to this and thinking about how you've reacted in past situations, don't turn this into regret. Regret freezes you in the past. Insight prepares you for the future. The point isn't to catch someone cheating. The point is to recognize when alignment is breaking down and respond in ways that preserve your self-respect regardless of outcome. This chapter is about regaining internal footing while uncertainty exists, not resolving everything immediately, not forcing clarity before it's ready, letting reality reveal itself without you distorting it through fear or control. When you can do that, you're no longer at the mercy of someone else's internal process. You're grounded in your own. If this chapter is helping you see why chasing reassurance backfires and why self-realignment is the only response that preserves dignity, like the video. In the final chapter, we'll bring this together and talk about what men should do once clarity arrives, whether that clarity leads to reconnection or confirms that it's time to walk away without bitterness, drama, or revenge. Chapter 5. Clarity doesn't arrive with fireworks. It arrives with a strange calm. One day you wake up and you're not confused anymore. You're not searching for signs. You're not rereading messages. You're not bracing your body for the next conversation. Something has settled, not because the outcome is good or bad, but because it's finally clear. And once clarity arrives, the only thing left is choice. Most men think the hard part is discovering the truth. It isn't. The hard part is deciding what to do once you know it, because clarity removes excuses. You can't hide behind misunderstanding anymore. You can't say you didn't know. You can't pretend it's temporary if it's been consistent. Clarity puts the weight back in your hands, and that weight feels heavier than uncertainty because it demands action without drama. If clarity leads to reconnection, it doesn't look like relief. It looks like accountability. Real reconnection isn't emotional speeches or promises. It's behavior snapping back into alignment without pressure. Effort returns, tone softens, presence deepens. You feel chosen again without asking. That kind of reconnection doesn't require constant monitoring because it stabilizes on its own. And if that doesn't happen, you already have your answer without needing to confront anything else. If clarity confirms that she's emotionally gone, the temptation is to turn that realization into anger, to replay moments, to confront, to extract confession or apology. That urge comes from wounded pride, not strength. Closure doesn't come from forcing someone to admit what they did. It comes from accepting what they chose. Acceptance doesn't mean approval. It means you stop trying to rewrite reality to soothe your ego. Walking away cleanly is one of the hardest skills men develop because it goes against everything they've been taught about winning, fixing, and fighting. But clean exits preserve your identity. You don't burn bridges, you don't smear names, you don't turn pain into performance. You simply step out of a situation that no longer aligns with your standards, and you do it without making yourself smaller or louder in the process. There's a quiet dignity in leaving without needing the other person to understand your reasons. Understanding isn't required. Alignment is. When alignment is gone, explanation becomes unnecessary. The strongest men don't leave to prove a point. They leave because staying would require betraying themselves. That kind of decision doesn't feel triumphant. It feels steady. And steadiness is what allows you to move forward without carrying bitterness into the next chapter of your life. Men often worry that walking away calmly makes it look like they didn't care. That fear keeps them entangled longer than they should be. Caring doesn't require chaos. In fact, the more someone cares, the less they need to dramatize their departure. Drama is a bid for validation. Calm is a sign of resolution. When you leave without theatrics, you're not minimizing the connection. You're honoring it by not turning it into something ugly. There's also a temptation to seek revenge, to show her what she lost, to be seen with someone else, to reassert worth through visibility. That impulse is understandable, but it keeps you tethered to the very dynamic you're trying to exit. Revenge still centers her. Indifference recenters you, not cold indifference, but emotional neutrality. The kind that comes from knowing your value doesn't require audience or comparison. Once clarity has done its work, the most important thing is what you do next internally. Do you turn this experience into a lens of cynicism or into one of discernment? Cynicism assumes betrayal everywhere. Discernment notices patterns without panic. Cynicism closes you off. Discernment sharpens your selection. The difference determines whether this experience makes you smaller or stronger. Men who grow from this don't become suspicious. They become selective. They don't interrogate future partners. They observe. They don't rush intimacy. They let behavior establish trust. They don't give loyalty blindly, but they also don't withhold warmth as punishment for past wounds. They understand that trust is built gradually through consistency, not demanded up front or given recklessly. You'll also notice something else after clarity arrives. Your intuition gets louder next time, not anxious, clear. You recognize emotional withdrawal earlier. You feel the difference between stress and detachment. You don't need proof to act. You trust your perception because you've seen how patterns unfold when ignored. That trust in yourself is the real gain from this experience, not avoidance of pain. A lot of men measure success by whether the relationship survives. That's the wrong metric. Survival without alignment isn't success. Success is preserving your self-respect regardless of outcome. Sometimes that means staying and rebuilding. Sometimes it means leaving and letting go. Both require courage. Neither is easy. But one always costs more in the long run if chosen out of fear instead of clarity. As this video comes to a close, understand this without turning it into a rule book. You can't prevent betrayal by controlling someone. You can't secure loyalty by explaining yourself better. What you can do is build a life and presence that doesn't require you to ignore your own instincts to maintain connection. You can choose environments where effort is mutual and alignment is visible. You can walk away from situations that require you to shrink or chase reassurance to feel safe. If this entire video helped you understand how cheating begins long before it becomes physical, how emotional detachment reveals itself in subtle ways, and how the strongest response is often the quietest one, take a moment and like the video. Not because it was comfortable, but because clarity matters more than comfort. Share it with someone who keeps waiting for proof instead of paying attention to process. And as you move forward, remember this quietly. You don't need to catch someone in the act to know when something is over. You only need the courage to trust what you already feel and the discipline to respond without losing yourself.